Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is David Owen Ransom. I'm on the marketing team here at Verisk Maplecroft, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. We'll be looking at climate change and the business risks of rising temperatures. A quick bit of background on Maplecroft. We're basically here to try and simplify big global issues so that you can understand and manage them a bit more easily. We apply our data and our expertise to support multinationals and our investor clients across a number of different functions and roles, and doing various things like supplier insight risk assessments, assessing asset above ground risks, conducting in-depth due diligence, and enhancing portfolio management. I'm delighted to introduce a couple of my colleagues who will be taking us through things today. Alongside me in the room here, I've got Newman, who is an environment and climate change analyst, and Dr. Richard Hewston, who is our principal climate change consultant. Now, a few housekeeping things just before we get going. Firstly, your microphone is muted by default for the duration of the session, but you can use the chat or Q&A panels to send us questions at any time. If you're in full screen mode, this can be found by the panel that's at the bottom of your screen. There should be some buttons there, or otherwise it might be on the right-hand side of your WebEx window as well. Note that if you want to ask any questions anonymously, you need to have the host and presenter option selected rather than all participants before sending a question. Otherwise, other people will be able to see what you say. Secondly, we'll try and answer as many questions as possible that come through from you guys, but with the time we have left over at the end, but we might run out of time, and if we don't, we'll try and follow up after the session by email. Also, Alice and Richard kind of have defined areas of expertise, so if any sort of question strays a little bit into somewhere else where we feel like another colleague might be a better person to answer it, then we'll take it away to them and follow up offline as well. And also, finally, I think we had one question about this already, but don't worry about scribbling down any notes, things like that. Just feel free to listen in because the slides and recording will be circulated around to everybody once the session is done in the next few days. So, without further ado, I'll now hand over to Alice and Rich.
Great, thanks very much, Dave. So, in this webinar, we're going to be taking a look at on the impacts of rising temperatures and increasing heat extremes on businesses, operations, and assets. Looking back over the past couple of years, we've seen many examples of temperature-related extreme weather events that have caused considerable damage in terms of fatalities, disruption, and economic costs. Last year's US wildfire season caused damages estimated at upwards of $10 billion US, and this year's season is looking to be even more costly, largely driven by the recent devastating fires in California. Heat waves have also affected Japan in July this year, with temperatures reaching 41 degrees. The 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, which brought 17 named storms, of which 10 became hurricanes, was the 7th most active season in the historical record and most active since 2005. Although the 2018 season has been less active, Hurricanes Florence and Michael nonetheless caused extensive damage in the southeast US. And we've also had prolonged heat waves, which has impacted parts of Europe this year, leading to devastating wildfires in a number of locations.
So kind of putting those events into context, what you're seeing on the screen now are economic and insured losses going back to 1980. And as Alice referenced there, the 2017 hurricane season is really the driver of the second largest loss that we've seen in the last 35 years. So you can see that spike on the right-hand side of the graph. But what we're really seeing is an upward trend. I mean, that's quite obvious. And that's in part being driven by more extreme events, but also the fact that we're now seeing more value at risk. We're seeing an increase in the value of assets exposed to extreme weather events. Another interesting feature to pull out from this graph is the fact that you're actually seeing a lot of year-on-year variability. And what that means is that it's actually increasingly difficult to manage climate-related risks because they're changing temporally. So we've seen kind of the economic impacts. Alice has mentioned a few events, and we've seen that graph there looking at the long-term trend. But what's probably masked within these figures is the subsequent effects on the knock-on to operations and supply chains. So one of the reasons that we've seen an increase in weather and climate rising up the corporate agenda recently is these losses. And in fact, a recent study by S&P found that the terms being used in earnings calls, weather and climate, were actually more numerous than those of oil, recession, and even Donald Trump. So that's wow. Quite something.
That's quite a lot. Wow.
So that's kind of where we are today. So what's in store for us in the future, Alice?
Yeah, well, as we've seen, how devastating temperature-related hazards can be in the current climate. But here's a look at what we can expect as future climate change takes hold. So global temperatures projected to increase by between 0.3 and 0.7 degrees by 2035. That's relative to a 1986 to 2005 baseline. And under the high emissions growth scenario, temperatures could even rise by up to 4.8 degrees by the end of the century. And the IPCC's most recent report projects devastating impacts at just 2 degrees of warming, including heat waves that could affect over a third of global population. So without significant progress towards reducing emissions, the consequences could be pretty catastrophic globally.
That's really interesting. Quite a lot of significant impacts and notable that we talk about 2 degrees as kind of being the point where we want to try and maybe even get to that with 1.5 maybe being unachievable, but even so, you're saying catastrophic is the word you're using.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the difference as well between that 1.5 and 2 degrees is going to be quite crucial in future as well, which is slightly concerning outlook.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so alongside our temperature rises, we're likely to see a rise in heat waves becoming more frequent and more intense over the century. But not only that, rising temperatures also will come warming sea surface temperatures, which could lead to more frequent and severe hurricane activity. And alongside rising temperatures, more frequent droughts, and again, increasing the occurrence of wildfires, with wildfire season lengths also likely to increase globally.
Yeah, it's interesting. You picked out 1.5 degrees there. I mean, I think we're almost certainly on track for at least 1.5. I mean, realistically, we're not keeping it below that, even with significant cuts to emissions.
So that's baked in already, you're saying?
Yeah, I'm fairly confident that we're at least 1.1, 1.2. If we stop emitting tomorrow, maybe we'll stay below that.
But that'd be a bit ambitious.
quite possibly. And ultimately, what that means is that that graph that we saw earlier of economic losses, that's going to keep going up. We're in store for more extreme climate-related events, more hurricanes, as Alice mentioned, more frequent and more intense wildfires, and that's why kind of managing physical climate risks becomes such a hot topic, if you'll excuse the pun, in recent years. We know that these events will be unfolding, so the question that all stakeholders are really asking businesses now, well, what are you doing about it? And I think that's why the TCFD recommendations were quite well, they were welcomed, because what they actually provide is a framework for businesses to understand how they should be beginning to really quantify those risks in financial terms, and how that the mainstreaming of that financial disclosure will help, to help insulate their businesses from future losses related to climate extremes, but also help when they're in their discussions with investors as well. So given that the TCFD recommendations provide a good basis, we've developed a number of data sets that can be used to help organizations comply with them. The next couple of sections that we're going to talk about are really providing some examples, focusing on physical risk, and in particular looking at temperature extremes. So the first one we're going to look at is heat stress. This really speaks to the employee base that sits at the heart of any value creation for almost every company. Heat stress is caused by a combination of high temperatures and high humidity. So these factors sort of combined essentially mean that they reduce your ability to undertake physical activities. They can cause confusion, dizziness, fatigue, nausea, and even in some extreme instances, death. So obviously, in terms of if you're experiencing these factors in the workplace, then your productivity will begin to drop. workers in outdoor vocations, those involving manual labour. Obviously, these are the most vulnerable. So these are sectors like agriculture, forestry, construction. That said, there's also in indoor workplaces where there's no air conditioning, such as the garment sector we've seen recently, there have been a number of high-profile injuries and even deaths that we've seen in Southeast Asia in that sector in recent years. And in terms of economic implications, when you roll these factors up, the reduction in labour capacity can be pretty significant. So Australia in 2013 is a good example. So it was estimated that through lost productivity and absenteeism, about $4 billion were wiped off the economy. So to help our clients better understand where their employees or where their workers in the supply chain could be exposed to heat stress risks, both now and in the future, we developed two heat stress indices. So one looking at the current conditions and one looking at conditions in about 30 years' time. So our data, usually the way that we present it, are in the index form. So what you're seeing here is the future climate heat stress index. So our indices run from a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being extreme risk at the red end of the spectrum, right the way through to low risk at the green end of the spectrum. And what our indices do are essentially help you visualize and quantify what can be quite a complex issue. So what we're looking at here is heat stress, but we have another 150 or so separate indices covering a range of human rights, political, environment, and societal risks. Within that portfolio, we have about 10 to 15 climate-related indices covering both physical and transition risks. The example that we see here of heat stress is one that is that a number of corporates actually use within their subscription to our data set. So typically when they're looking at this, they're using this to either overlay their own operations or overlay their supplier base to understand where heat stress could cause disruption to their operations or to their supplier base. So for example, we did some work recently with a manufacturing client who they used the heat stress index, but they also used a number of other climate-related hazards to look at their operating sites. I think they had about 20 sites globally, mainly concentrated in Southeast Asia. But what they were really trying to understand is which hazards they were most exposed to and where, and that would help inform where they would implement the appropriate resilience measures.
So in the case of heat extremes, as Rich has just discussed, heat stress has the potential to reduce labour capacity, which can lead to declines in outputs and have considerable economic implications. So to better understand these impacts, we used our heat stress indices alongside national exports data to investigate which regions and countries are expected to face the greatest economic impacts of rising heat stress. So recognising that labour capacity losses are likely to be greater in sectors with higher work intensities, we assigned work intensity categories to export sectors in our studies. So for example, as Richard discussed, agriculture and extractive sectors are highly work intensive, often involving outdoor labour, which makes these sectors more vulnerable to heat stress risks. And in doing this exercise, we're able to estimate the extent of exposure of heat stress risks as a result of the profile of a country's export. So as we're displaying on the map now, the regions in which agriculture and extractives are the dominant sectors are facing the greatest risk to the export value from future heat stress. So you clearly pick out West and Central Africa with facing the greatest risks in future because of the dominance of these sectors to their export economies. The Middle East and North Africa region is also at risk, where obviously the extractives industry is of extreme importance, as well as South and Southeast Asia, where manufacturing is the dominant export sector, but agriculture and extractives are also highly important industries in these regions. But heat stress doesn't just pose a risk to export economies or have national impacts, but it can also disrupt global supply chains. For example, if productivity drops or production costs increase as a result of labour capacity losses, prices could rise for importers, or companies might be driven to source from locations with lower heat stress exposure. If we look at the cocoa bean supply chain, for example, around 60% of global cocoa exports originate from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. The impact of rising heat stress could, for example, limit the production of this commodity and thereby impacting supply chains globally. And here we just illustrated a few examples of countries which are particularly reliant on cocoa imports from these two countries and could face supply disruption in the coming decades.
And I think it's a really interesting point there. I mean, Alice, we've been talking about the impact of heat stress on workers within those supply chains, but also we've got the impact on the raw materials themselves, so the cocoa bean itself and how well that can adapt to a changing climate. So it's another factor to build into that.
Yeah, because you kind of want to think about, for agricultural commodities particularly, you want to think about the heat sensitivity, I suppose, of that crop to its environment, I guess.
Definitely.
Something like coffee would be another one to think about, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess
in that same vein.
Definitely, I think been some research about the climatic suitability of these crops to where they are currently grown, which is definitely another consideration.
And it kind of demonstrates the fact that you need to be thinking about these issues fairly holistically when you're trying to manage climate risks. Kind of on that note, what are the ways to manage those risks? Obviously, where it's possible, possibly not in the field, the coffee fields or the cocoa fields, but is obviously with air conditioning. So the IEA have projected that the demand for cooling for air conditioning is likely to triple by 2050. So in this section of the webinar, we're going to explore some of the recent research we've done to assess, how an increase in cooling demand could pose disruption risks to both operations and supply chains. So again, here we've got another one of our indices. This time looking at energy demand for cooling. It's actually measuring cooling degree days. So for those of you not familiar with that, a cooling degree day is simply a measure for how long a temperature is above a certain threshold, how high it is above that threshold, and for how long it is. So obviously, warmer locations will see higher cooling degree days. There'll be a greater demand for cooling in those locations. Again, we have an index looking at current conditions, the current climate, and we've got one looking out to the mid-century over the next 30 years or so. We've actually got a number of clients who use these indices, but probably a really good and a salient example would be an investor who has used these indices to screen against its real estate portfolio. So it's able to identify some fairly high-level patterns to understand where cooling demand was going to increase more than others, but also was able to identify particular assets where that increase was particularly high, and then do a bit of a deeper dive to understand how material that issue is for that particular investment. So looking at those two indices together, we can really begin to understand where we're seeing some of the biggest increases in cooling demand. Overall, the total population in extreme risk countries is set to increase by more than 5 times by mid-century. It's probably important to note that not only are we seeing temperatures rising, we're also seeing population rising. And actually, some of the highest rates of population growth are in the warmest countries, so there's a bit of a double whammy going on, as illustrated by the fact that the biggest demand for cooling is set to occur in West Africa.
Yes, it's interesting you put up that point about population, Rich, because I guess alongside population growth, we've also seen a huge upward trend in global urbanization. So with cooling demand, it's likely to be higher in urban areas. and with another 2.7 billion people expected to be living in cities by 2050, electricity infrastructure will come under increasing strain in urban locations. So for businesses, this could mean rising costs and more frequent supply disruption when heat waves do occur and temperatures soar in the coming decades. Businesses face the greatest disruption risks in countries where electricity infrastructure is particularly weak and where urban populations are growing rapidly. So in another study of ours, we've looked using our cooling degree days, looking alongside current urban access to electricity, which we use as a proxy for the strength of national power infrastructure, and looking at this alongside urban population projections for 2050, and using this to identify which countries are likely to face the greatest challenges over the next 30 years. And as the graph you're looking at illustrates, it's quite clear that Africa is the region, again, set to face the greatest challenges. So countries in Africa are already facing a high number of cooling degree days annually. And on the graph, this is illustrated by the larger red circles, which are indicating higher risk scores in our current cooling degree days index, which Rich just displayed the map for on the previous slide. Africa is also expected to see a high increase in the number of cooling degree days by mid-century, so these conditions are likely to worsen. Currently, only around 76% of the region's urban population has access to electricity, which compares to a global average of about 97%. And the urban population is projected to grow by about 235% by the middle of the century. So particularly challenging times ahead for that region. But it's not, the disruption risks aren't just confined to Africa. If we look at Asia's manufacturing hubs, we're also likely to see some challenges for operators in key locations. For example, India has an urban population that's set to double by the middle of the century, with the country already facing annual outages in power during summer heat waves when electricity demands spike. Even in Europe, which is expected to see the lowest increase in cooling degree days, heat waves also pose disruption risks for businesses, because it's not just a case of meeting average electricity demand as cooling requirements rise. The power systems actually have to be able to handle peak demand, which is another challenge altogether. So for businesses operating in these markets, it's identifying these risks early and implementing measures to mitigate the worst impacts, which is going to be really crucial over the long term.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. That was really interesting to take it through and kind of talk about those case studies. So I think we've kind of got some time now towards the back end of this session for a bit of Q&A, a bit of discussion on things. So if anybody's got any questions to send through, please do get in touch via the chat panel and things like that, and I can put some things to Rich and Alice and put them on the spot. Couple of things that have come through so far. Someone asking about kind of how the materiality of these kinds of physical risk issues. Sorry, apologies. For the oil and gas sector in particular, because it sounds like they're kind of saying, well, does this really matter for oil and gas, because they're pretty used to operating in these kinds of extreme environments anyway. So does heat stress or cooling demands and things like that, how much will that really affect that particular sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a valid question. It's probably a good one. When you think about, just looking at heat stress, for example, you mentioned in whoever asked the question, you kind of mentioned the fact that they're already operating in the extreme locations. You think about some of the places where these workers are based, then obviously they're going to be subjected to harsh conditions, potentially wet, cold, windy, but also high temperatures as well. So you're looking at workforce implications there. You're also looking at the physical impacts on kind of operational machinery. So while they do exist in extreme environments, some of the design spec are built for specific operating ranges. they're built to quite a high spec, so they may be looking at currently 1 in 200 year wind speeds or 1 in 200 year extreme temperatures. But obviously we're seeing a shift in those extremes, so that will affect the design spec, and ultimately that will affect the cost of having to bring in a piece of machinery or a piece of equipment that is slightly more expensive because you're expecting high temperatures or lower temperatures, or higher wave heights if you're in an offshore environment. These are all factors that need to be included within the project commercials. One of the things that we've actually looked at recently, taking it up probably to a slightly higher level, is using our corporate exposure tool to sort of benchmark companies and their assets in terms of their physical exposure to climate change. So looking at where their assets are, using our sister company Wood Mackenzie's intel on that to understand where they are in relation to changes in the physical climate.
So that's taking the asset level information that Woodmac's got on. I think at the moment we're looking at just oil and gas companies, but there's scope for us to go further with this. But we're looking at where these companies are generating their value and the physical locations around the world, and then overlaying the kind of the commercial data on top of that as well. So we can factor in things like production reserves, net present value, and other metrics like that to further sort of add colour to the picture. But yeah, so in terms of overlaying our data like that, yes, we kind of take the asset level information of our clients or from where we have the information ourselves, and build out those kinds of risk assessments for our clients.
Exactly, and you sort of get a view of the entire portfolio.
Yeah, sure.
Whether that's oil and gas or whether that's a manufacturing company looking at their processes.
Sure. So yeah, it takes that asset level information, which is challenging to come by in some circumstances. I suppose when you think about a retailer, for instance, and saying how are we looking at the supply chain? Are we looking at what retail locations that they're working with? I don't know. So it can get really challenging with that. But when you're looking at fixed assets, I think it becomes a bit easier, I suppose. But even so, you still see large companies like Wood Mackenzie basing their entire business models on those kinds of things. So what we're doing with corporate exposure is really interesting. Okay. So next question. So somebody's asking how does your data support a sort of a due diligence process? I think we're thinking about this mainly from an investment perspective here, because so the kind of saying that what we're showing here feels a bit high level in the way that the data is kind of being displayed. So how can we support kind of a bit more of an in-depth deep dive, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a great point. What we've shown today and what we've looked at is quite high level. So we've had the two maps of the indices, which are obviously on a 0 to 10 scale, which, if you present that kind of information to your deal team during an acquisition process, for example, you might get a few raised eyebrows. But really what our data lets you do is either look at your existing portfolio or potential new assets that you're bringing into that, and do that high-level screening. So once you've done that high-level screening, and it flags an extreme risk for whatever it may be, whether it's heat stress, whether it's cooling degree days, whether it's flooding, whether it's tropical cyclones, whatever it may be, is then to go to the next level to say, well, I know it's in location X, what's the driver behind that? Is it a changing storm pattern? Is it the fact that you've got rising temperatures in that location that are higher than in adjacent locations? And we can do a deeper dive to understand on the physical risk side to understand what those changes are, but also, we've worked with clients to understand what the sensitivities of those assets are. So there are certain assets which, like a wind farm, for example, may not be sensitive to changes in rainfall, whereas investment in agriculture would be highly sensitive to changes in rainfall. So it's about understanding, what those sensitivities are and what it is within kind of the broader physical climate risk that is presenting as a risk, and sort of taking that to the next level to do that deeper dive.
Okay, right, yeah. So, and I suppose would there be sensitivities by kind of industry sector as well, possibly, or like along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a bit of work around the sector sensitivities, but even within that, if you're talking real assets, within that there are differences.
Sure, yeah.
So again, going back to agriculture, you could bucket that as a sector, but coffee would be different to cocoa, would be different to avocado, or whatever it may be. Those sensitivities will change. Solar versus wind, if you bucketed that under renewable energy as a sector, again, you've got slightly different sensitivities.
Sure, so it becomes quite a complex problem to figure out a bit. But
it can be, but it's very rare that you're looking across these huge swaths. It's very rare that you're comparing apples and pears and avocados and renewable energy. So it does make it slightly easier once you have a slightly narrower field.
Yeah. I've got one question about kind of coming back to some of the research that we've done on cooling degree days and things like that, and saying, have we done any work looking at the cost of the infrastructure required to support the population and the kind of cooling requirements and that kind of thing? I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, Alice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In this study, we didn't look into that as such. We were more looking at the disruption risks for businesses, with the implications being growing populations, higher temperatures, more power demand, and what that means for the power systems, and whether blackouts will become more common, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we were looking at more from the disruption and economic costs from that end. But definitely something that would be really interesting to look into from another perspective for a particular sector, I guess, power sector.
Well, it's an interesting question, because there's the kind of the cost of powering the systems to cool whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But there's also the fact that we're looking out over the next 10, 15, 20 years or so, that these energy systems are also having to decarbonize. There's a lot of pressure. We're moving away from coal, from oil, to gas, to renewables. So you've got that cost dynamic involved in there as well.
Definitely, particularly in developing countries, I guess, where they have this choice to sort of leapfrog the fossil fuels, maybe switch to renewables, decentralization, that kind of thing. It's definitely open for discussion, I think, that one, yeah.
Yeah, and then that also brings it back to that peak, the peak demand that you mentioned.
Yeah.
If you have an energy system that is reliant on solar power, for example, that actually maps quite nicely with when you get peak demand for cooling. But if it's reliant on a different renewable energy, then perhaps that's like the opposite.
Sure.
Difficult, yeah.
Okay. Well, another question. So I suppose it's kind of it's timely that this webinar is happening now, because we're having this discussion, because there's obviously the conference is happening in Poland at the moment, and I think someone's just wondering have we got any thoughts on what's happening with that? What does it kind of mean for where we're headed? I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, Alice, with the IPCC report and the 1.5 and 2 degrees thing, and the word catastrophic you used. But I was just wondering if you guys have any thoughts on the kind of wider picture from a kind of multinational agreement perspective.
Difficult. We'll start with that one. Yeah, good question.
It's a good question. I think if we knew the answer, we'd...
Yeah.
I think what we've seen since, we had the breakthrough in Paris a couple of years ago, where the agreement was forged, and now we're really getting into the nitty-gritty, and that's showing.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of enthusiasm, and it gained a lot of traction. 2017, that began to slow, I think, a little bit in the second half of 2018, and I think we've seen the outcome of that at the COP at the moment. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few days. We've got 3 or 4 days left.
Yeah.
When you've kind of got the big hitters coming into town. I think this is where the true negotiating skills will come to the fore. I think one of the things that we're hearing from our clients certainly is the fact that while these negotiations are going on and different countries are committing to different levels of ambition to reduce emissions by X%, we're already committed to a level of warming, as I mentioned, and that means we're going to not only keep experiencing the very hot summer that we saw in the Northern Hemisphere this year, but also the active hurricane season that we saw in the Atlantic last year. These events are going to keep happening. They have been happening over the last 30 years, as we've seen, but we still don't have a good handle on managing what we're exposed to now. So you layer on, even if it's a degree or 2 degrees on top of that, then there's still risk out there to manage, regardless of what goes on at COP this week.
Ominous. Ominous. Okay, I think another question. I suppose it's kind of somewhat more abstract, but someone's asking what's kind of the most interesting piece of work we've or example of a piece of work that we've done for a client on a climate-related topic recently. It's quite broad.
I've got a favourite.
So Rich is going to throw out his favourite. Here we go. We did some work for Caring, the high-end fashion company, and it's in the public domain. So if you Google Maplecroft Caring and climate change, it should be up there somewhere. And it was actually looking at the impact of climate change on some of their key raw materials. So we looked at 6, I think, including cotton, lamb, leather, and a few others. But the one that I found really interesting was vicuña. So this is a camelid that lives at a particular elevation in the Andes, and it can't be farmed. If you try and put it in a fenced-in area, then they don't do so well. But the hair that is collected from these animals, produces really, really expensive items of clothing. But the fact that they only exist at a certain altitude in the Andes means that they're hugely climate sensitive. So as temperatures rise, what is happening is that the biomes that they survive in and thrive in are actually shifting higher and higher in altitude. And obviously, if the temperature exceeds a certain point, then they're not going to be able to survive in those locations. So that was for me, that was a really interesting one.
I was going to pick that one as well, actually. Yeah, very different.
Sure. So most interesting, I suppose, but kind of building on that, I suppose. How can some of the projects we've done with our clients integrate into their kind of day-to-day workflows? Because climate is it's a very big ticket issue, and so how does it kind of get factored in on a more sort of regular basis in terms of thinking, planning, strategy, but also day-to-day operational considerations as well?
Yeah, so I mean, a piece of work like that, and as we've referenced earlier, where you're looking to understand where you could be experiencing these changes, will factor in terms of where you're sourcing that raw material, for example. So if you have long-term strategic supply relationships for a particular raw material, then understanding maybe not what's going on in the climate in the next 30 years, but certainly having an understanding of where there's greater variability likely in the next 5 years, that's a material issue. So that would be factored in within your procurement team and potentially within your procurement strategy as one of a number of issues that you'd be looking at.
That's very cool. Just look to see if we've got any further questions coming through. If anybody else has got any other further questions on what we've been discussing or talking about, please do feel free to send those in. You mentioned our corporate exposure tool earlier, Rich. I think that's certainly something that's of interest to us at the moment. Is exploring how we can look more closely at kind of wider industries and looking across the whole sort of asset spectrum. At the moment, we're looking at that just from an oil and gas perspective and in partnership with Mackenzie. But I think we're also looking to go broader than that into the mining sector as well, and potentially others. So we're interested to understand a bit more about where people are interested in us looking at. This is obviously primarily from an investment perspective, I'd suggest, but also for the specific industries too. So yeah, if anybody's got any thoughts or feedback for us on those kinds of things, that'd be very interesting. But yeah, unless Rich or Alice, you kind of got any other sort of signing off comments, unless anyone's got any further questions, then I think we're nearing the end of what we want to say today. So, Rich, any final thoughts?
Nothing from me. Just like to thank everyone who tuned in.
Yep.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for Q&A, who's sent comments in and things like that. It's been interesting to stimulate the discussion as well. If you would like to send in another question, we haven't got a chance to answer it or anything like that, or you come up with it later, please do send it in to info@maplecroft.com. We'd be very happy to answer that as well, and to talk about any of the kind of particular issues that you might be experiencing, whether you're an investor, a corporate, or in oil and gas, working somewhere in a far-flung location in the world. Be very interested to have a discussion. Yeah, so we'll be sending around the slides and recording and that kind of stuff of the session and in its entirety and in the next few days, hopefully, if technology supports us in doing that. But otherwise, I think that's us done. So thank you so much for attending and for listening in. Yeah, have a very Merry Christmas. We're almost there. So goodbye.
Bye.